Yeah, we might get going, given it's past 1 o'clock now. Hopefully some more people will also be able to drop in and take part. At the moment, I think everybody is muted. So if you want to ask a specific question, you can unmute yourself in the lower left-hand corner. But for the moment, we'll just sort of leave you muted so that I can say a few things. And then I think, Ola, we can unmute everybody. I'm not sure how. I might leave that up to you.
Yeah.
So you will have read comments from me and seen my videos as we've gone through the first 3 weeks. I'm Dr. Kate Cregan, and I currently work at RMIT in Melbourne. So for me, it's 1 o'clock, 1:05. I know for others of you, it's 1:30, and for some people, it's 12 o'clock. But as long as everybody sort of manages to come in, I've been working in this field of HDR training for about 10 years. In fact, I've recently retired from it and unexpectedly find myself working again, unlike some people in the university sector at the moment who are unexpectedly finding themselves out of work, unfortunately. But I've run this course, I think this is the 4th time now, Ola. It was last year and this year. Yeah. So I wrote the course as well as being the moderator of it. And it's an issue that's kind of something I've been interested in for all of my research career, specifically ethics, human ethics, but also research practices in general. So I'll get started, I think, by answering the questions that were asked ahead of time. And there's 2 from April and 1 from Mohammed Sabuj.
Yes, I find out it's now working.
Yep. Okay. So what I think I'll answer the 2 from April first, and then I'll move on to the other one because there's sort of a nice flow from them. So the question about fairness and mirroring, I think maybe on a social level, people may imitate others to gain acceptance. Although, of course, that doesn't always mean that's their real opinion. People often put on a social mask when they're in company. You know, we present a side of ourselves to other people that is acceptable. But there are also plenty of examples of people going along with somebody else's point of view. Once that sort of interaction is removed, they might behave differently though, or think differently. So when we come to the principles of research integrity, including fairness, what we're doing is asking each researcher to behave according to the principles. So not how others might behave. It's actually asking you to think independently. And sometimes that might include not going along with someone who might even be in a senior position to you, and that can be quite uncomfortable. So it's not about copying or mirroring good or bad research behaviour, but in understanding and embodying the principles behind good research behaviour and being able to apply them in new and varying situations. So thinking through, questioning, perhaps negotiating rather than mirroring. Because if all we did was mirror, that might quickly lead us down the wrong path, especially if the person we were mirroring had got it wrong. And yes, that should also be applied to the sources that we cite and thinking through and questioning the applicability and integrity of our sources. So in research, that should always be from peer-reviewed, scholarly, reputable sources, whether traditional or online. All these things now appear online as well, but we need to actually investigate what we're reading. And as the question about the Vancouver Protocol, one of the linked documents that you found, April, actually explains that the Vancouver Protocol was the first attempt to ensure fair and appropriate research publication practices. So all the other codes and protocols around the world are in one way or another related to it. They draw on it. There's some variation across disciplines because there are differences in practices across disciplines, but the basic principles around authorship are pretty standard. So if you look at the protocol, you'll see that the definition of who deserves authorship is very similar to what is expected in Australia and in the documents that we use. What's really important, and I'm pretty sure I've put this somewhere in the materials, is that if you are enrolled through or working from an Australian university, no matter where you are in the world, and a lot of the ATN students, a lot of the students in this course might not necessarily be in Australia, they might be physically somewhere else in another country, but even so, if you're enrolled through an Australian university or working through an Australian university, you're expected to follow the Australian codes and principles of research integrity. They will be similar to those used in other countries, but there will also be some variation. But for us as Australian-based or Australian-connected researchers, we're required to follow those kinds of local advice. The question from Mohammed, how can research integrity be utilised in all sectors of research? Great question. Part of the intention of a university degree, no matter what the discipline, is to grow appropriate researchers. So in undergraduate courses, a lot of time is spent on forming the groundwork of knowledge in a discipline. So those courses will concentrate on the necessary basics, so general theory, standard practices, taking a broad brushstroke approach to a discipline. But for any discipline, increasingly, that can include small research projects in second and third year subjects so that students are given the opportunity to try out academic research through a minor project. That has to be made manageable though, so that it can be done in a way that fits a semester. And not all research is going to be possible in that short a period of time. Research takes time. You have to set it up, you have to think about it beforehand, and then from there go through the different stages of research. So in those kinds of subjects in undergraduate courses, that will include research integrity, although it won't always be obvious to the students taking the subject. So it might be in the way that the course has been put together, or it might be more explicit in teaching people about the best basics of ethical principles and practices relevant to a discipline. It's made explicit for HDRs because you're trainee researchers, you're researchers in training, and it's necessary for you to know explicitly how to research with integrity and to carry that through into the way that you act at work and the way that you act in your research, and how you write up your publications and disseminate that research. So it's all kind of implicit in undergraduate teaching. It becomes more explicit the further you go on. The last question, and I'm really pleased that you're here so that you can maybe expand a little bit. The last part of the question was, I'm not quite sure what you meant about a platform for sharing, unless you mean contributing to open source data platforms. That sort of thing is happening more and more, but sometimes that can also be hampered by commercial in confidence arrangements. It's very much dependent on the discipline and kinds of research contracts that are put together. So, Mohammed, if you can expand on that, if I haven't understood you correctly, that would be great.
I was talking about the same thing, but just a little bit of when I participated in 3-minute thesis, I have heard that the finalists are providing the showcase or something like that. That means providing, there should be a platform where the researchers who are submitting their thesis, they should explain about their findings, they should discuss, they should just inform the reviewers, the examiners about their data. Either those data are reliable, either those data weren't manipulated, like these sorts of things. There should be a platform where everybody should have access to gain what he's doing, and people should have access to ask about the findings, like these sorts of things.
Your microphone's a little bit, or it might be my speaker is a little bit wobbly bubbly, but I think I understand what you said. So that is in part taken care of by those kinds of large data sharing platforms I was talking about. But if you mean at the end of the thesis, at the end of everybody's thesis, I guess the way that that's expected that will be done is through publication. So the thesis itself is a publication, and the examination process is there to test the reliability of the data. So that is sort of part of the intention of examination of the thesis. But from there on, yes, you're supposed to, it's kind of optional, but it's kind of not optional to publish your research. It's an expectation of everybody that you get your results out there. Now, it's not always easy to do that, but that is the way that traditionally and still people are expected to send their research out and prove that it is reliable research rather than it just sitting in the thesis. Every PhD student or master's student, more so for PhD students, is expected to publish from their thesis. Does that answer your question?
Yes, that's it.
Great.
Thank you.
That's okay, my pleasure. So I think I can see a question there from Abdul. If any PhD researcher wants to be involved with any project, collaborative or individual, which is not part of academic or institutional work, does he or she still need to gain ethics approval? That's a really interesting question. While you're a student, I'm pretty sure there are constraints on being able to take part in external research as a co-researcher, depending on whether you're your project is part of a larger project as well. So that you would need to know through your institution and your own agreement. You'd have to check your agreement. But if it's something that's unrelated to your PhD work, and perhaps you're doing it as paid work, as a research assistant, that work, if you want to publish from it, yes, it does need ethics approval. And if it involves human beings, yes, you should undergo some form of ethics approval. Now, if it's unconnected to a university, there are other ways that you can gain ethics approval. So if you're working for a government department or the research is attached to a government department, many government departments have their own ethics approval process. If you're working through a school, schools are related to departments of education and they have their own ethics approval committees. Hospitals have their own ethics approvals committees. If lots of bodies have ethics internal but independent, separate ethics approval committees. If you're doing research that is not related to an institution that has its own ethics approval process, there is at least one, I think it's based in South Australia, there's at least one independent external ethics approval or ethics independent ethics board that you have to pay for the service, because people will sit down and read your ethics application. You have to go through a process, and that involves people, and people should be paid for work, that will approve those sorts of research. The cutting point is whether you want to publish reliable, reputable outcomes. So if you were doing something that was, say, commercial market research, that might not go through ethical approval if you don't intend to publish the results. If it's a straightforward wanting to know how much people want to buy cornflakes, that may not need ethical approval. You just go out, you do the survey, because you're using it to inform a business practice. You're not necessarily using it to try and make important, truthful claims about the world. Whereas if you were doing a similar kind of research while a student in a university, yes, you would. You would need to have ethical approval and it would be a relatively straightforward ethical approval, low risk, to survey people about their understanding or their desire to buy cornflakes. But you would probably be asking a slightly more nuanced question rather than, do you like cornflakes? So it's going to depend on what the purposes are, the end results are, whether you need to get ethics approval or not, or whether you should get ethics approval or not. But if you're going to be doing anything that might inconvenience somebody or potentially cause them harm, even minor harm, then yes, you should. Is that enough of an answer, Abdul? Okay. you can either ask a follow-up question in the chat line or just thumbs up. I can't actually see you right at the moment. I have to flick through people.
Hi, Kate. So can I say that to add on to Abdul's question, so can I say that if you are doing research on commercial, like just basic interview with people, you do not need to to apply for any human ethics.
If you're not working at a place that requires it, no. But many places will require it. So if you were asking questions, as I said, if you were, say, working as an internal researcher for a Department of Health, well, then you probably would need to fill out the processes that are related to ethics committees. But that depends very much on the outcomes and the intentions. Yeah. So it's knowing your own workplace, it's knowing your own policies and procedures of your workplace. But when we come to research, which is what we're really talking about in relation to research integrity and practice, when it comes to research that you want to then publish from in a reputable journal, then you're going to need it, because the journal won't print material that hasn't gone through an ethics process.
Ethics. I see.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm just wondering that in honesty in our research, right? Sometimes you might not be able to find articles that you assume that you have it has not came out, but in terms of like when you conduct your data analysis, you may think, because I'm going to conduct a thematic analysis, and I'm just thinking that in terms of interpretation, sometimes you might assume that this is the interpretation, but you may not know that there are already existing interpretation out there in the field. So is that still not enough? But how would you know that enough is enough?
That's the question for your supervisor. That's what your supervisor is there for, is to guide you on when you've done enough background research to. So.
But you're still being honest in this
library research first. You need to do the library research first. You need to find out from scholarly sources as much as you possibly can about your topic. Okay.
All right. Thank you, Kate.
That's okay. Okay. So Farouk, you've asked how important is it to ask your supervisor before collaborating with other labs outside your uni? Is it about fairness to share first with supervisors? I'm not quite sure what you mean by that. So
I can clear you, Kate.
Yeah.
Basically, I was thinking some people I come to know with my some friends from other area of research, they collaborate back home countries.
Yep.
And they are getting papers from that. So I was like, if you are working in one lab with your supervisors and team, and you are supporting other thoughts as well, so is it come in research integrity or something like that, or you need to take them in confidence that yes, we are doing something, and giving ideas and suggestions?
Yeah, okay, I get what you're asking now. Yeah, it's going to depend. There could be an issue of conflict of interest there. That's definitely possible. If you're working on something that's in the same area as what you're doing here, then that does oppose a potential conflict of interest, and you at least need to let both parties know that this is a possibility, and before agreeing to do outside work that is doing the same thing as what you're doing here, both parties would need to know.
Like, as a student, is it important? And if I go for a postdoc, like I'm in my final year PhD, so if I go for a postdoc and I do this, like, of course there is no supervisor when you are doing postdoc, but there is a team which you are carrying with you, and the whole team, so you need to talk to them, or is it fine? Like, yeah, I saw some people doing that, so I was questioning, like, how can we handle this? Is better to discuss, or
I think it's always better to discuss. I think it's always better to be open and clear about what your
Mm-hmm.
intentions are. I mean, you also need to weigh that with how connected it is, so to what you're already doing.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, once your degree is finished, if you want to continue having a working relationship with the people who have been your supervisors, well, then you might want to share everything with them. But if you're going to move on to another life, another job, well then, and it's not connected directly to continuing to work with your supervisors, you might want to ask their opinion, might want to ask them to be your referees for a job. So you
Okay.
might want to let them know in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, if it's moving on to something completely different, it might
Yeah.
also just be your business. But
Yes.
you do need to think about whether, particularly if it's at the same time, whether working for two different groups
Mm-hmm.
is going to be a conflict of interest, in which case you definitely need to say something about it. You need to be honest and open about it.
Yeah, exactly. Yep, that's fine. That's my answer. Thank you.
That's okay.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Okay, is it Xiliang? I hope I'm
Yes, it's a
saying
good
that
question.
okay. I want to just one of my papers is going to be published. I want to add some other PhD students to my author list because they helped me a lot in my research, but my supervisor rejected it. He said those students didn't make an intellectual contribution. So what can I do? Your supervisor is right, unless your PhD friends have actually taken part in the research and made a considerable intellectual contribution along the guidelines that are in the course, the things we've gone through. It's not appropriate to name people even if they have made a contribution in terms of chatting to you and maybe thinking through an idea with you. If there has not been sufficient intellectual contribution, then they don't deserve naming. But you are within your rights to acknowledge them. So in a footnote or in any acknowledgements sort of section that's available to you in the article, you say, and I would like to thank A, B, C, D for talking to me about this question. Or if they have come up with a particular, they've challenged you in a particular way, you can actually say, you know, and I would particularly like to thank person B for asking me this question. It made me think differently about the topic. Having conversations with our friends is sometimes a great way of sort of getting our own brain working, but that doesn't make them a researcher in our project. It does make them someone that it's worthwhile saying thank you to in a public way, though. So does that make sense? Yeah, and definitely thank them personally too. You would, you know, take them for a cup of coffee, buy them a nice cake, and say thank you. But sometimes it's really lovely to. I've done it in, I think, nearly every publication I have. I've said thank you to the people who have supported me in ways other than being a co-researcher. They've had some effect. It's easier to do it in something that's longer format, like a book, because you get a whole page or a couple of pages of acknowledgements where you can add them in. But if you have a good look at, say, articles that you've been relying on, you'll probably find in there somewhere there will be a thank you to person B, or it'll be at the end of, you know, acknowledgements. Some journals will give you an actual acknowledgements section to name people that you want to acknowledge.
So I guess that the small section acknowledgement is the area where we can thank everyone who has contributed to our research. Not necessarily that we have to gain their consent.
If you're just saying thank you, no, you don't. You don't really.
Because I believe that there would be our family support as well.
Yeah, yeah. But if you're naming an author, yes, you do. So I have actually been in a position once myself where I had contributed to something in a way that might have deserved authorship, but I actually didn't want my name associated with it because I didn't like the end product. And I said to the people, please do not name me. And they didn't name me as an author, but then I found out some years later that they had named me in the acknowledgement section, and I was quite cross because I had said, please don't put my name anywhere in this publication. And I can give examples. One of the discussions for this week is actually based on a real example where a former student had named a former supervisor as an author without telling that person, and the person had nothing to do with the writing of the article, and potentially that could get the former supervisor in trouble for having their name on something that they had nothing to do with the writing of that article.
Just out of curiosity, what action would be taken if this happens? If the researcher...
For the supervisor, it could be research misconduct. They could be held accountable for not keeping up the standards.
But it's not the supervisor's fault. He's not aware that his name is being published.
Exactly. And so that person had...
That's not fair.
That person had to write to the former student in very strong terms and say, you have done something incorrect, and that could get me in trouble. And I
feel that the action should be taken against the researcher because it is not the supervisor's fault. He is not even aware that his name is being published. Yeah, so the action should be taken against the PhD researcher for not getting the consent from the supervisor.
We are all personally responsible for keeping an eye on these things and making sure our name isn't misused. So, which luckily that particular person had been keeping an eye on it and was able to send the former student, several emails making it very clear that they shouldn't do it. Okay.
Just wondering, why would someone do not want their names to be in the published when they have contributed significantly to that research?
In my case, I didn't like the outcomes. I didn't agree with the way that the final article was written up. Or the final publication was written up. I didn't actually think the claims that it was making were supportable. I didn't think it was good research, so I didn't want the name on it.
Yeah, I understand that now. Wow, interesting. I wonder what other people think.
I think it's not about getting the name, because if someone is not directly participating in any research, it's not like I have guided to do this thing very time ago, and now they're just using my name to the research. That's not the thing. For every research and for every publication, the authors should be actively participate in the research, so far I know. So that's why if someone is just willing to put someone's name in the research, that's not the thing.
No, and sometimes, people with, as you're sort of alluding to, people with people might use somebody's name with the hope of getting published. To do that without permission, that's actually really bad.
Yeah.
It's unethical and inappropriate. Yeah.
Certainly. Yeah.
Okay, so do we have other questions from other people? Jonathan, have you got anything to ask?
Sort of. It's not really a question, more. I've been pondering the difference between being honest and just telling the truth. Because being honest is sort of communicating what exactly is going on. Whereas you can tell the truth and not be honest. If that makes any sense.
Yes, it does. That's kind of, it's the way that politicians can be honest sometimes, if I understand what you're saying, that there are ways of editing the truth, and you might believe you're being honest, but you're not actually being transparent. So it's not the kind of honesty that is important in research. Yes, I do get what you mean, and it's quite a common thing to see in politics, on both sides or any side of the political divide. There will be that editing of details, but when it comes to research, because research is really trying to make truth claims about the world and about knowledge, if you're dishonest in that, well, in some disciplines it's not going to have major flow-on effects, apart from misleading people. But in other disciplines, it can actually end up being a matter of life and death. So if you are putting out, if we think of the current pandemic and the discussion we were having about what's an appropriate treatment and what's not an appropriate treatment, there are a number of drugs that have been trialled on an experimental basis during the last 6 months or so. Some of them have been withdrawn because it was found on application that they were actually doing more harm than good. Whereas if the researchers had not been honest about the downside of some of those drugs, that might have actually led to more fatalities. So it depends what discipline you're in, the actual concrete effects that they're going to have. But yes, as honesty in how you present your results is terribly important, because we're trying to make bigger claims about the world than perhaps politicians might be wanting to.
It's kind of funny because the first week was on honesty, and I started watching a show where someone basically, he always tells the truth, but he's never honest about it, if that makes any sense.
Okay, share with us the name of the show.
Lucifer, if you've heard of it.
Oh, yes, I have.
Yeah, and you can see what I'm getting at.
Yes, I admit to being a Netflix vegetable. And yes, I have seen the show. Yeah, and on the other side of it, as you know, sort of pointed out in the initial materials, sometimes it's not socially acceptable to be absolutely truthful, because it can be hurtful, and unnecessarily hurtful. So at a social level, sometimes we do edit ourselves. But there's a difference between the way we might go about behaving in our personal relationships and what we might do when we're conducting research. It is funny though.
Sorry, maybe I have not watched that movie, but how do you not be truthful and still being honest?
No. So basically, he doesn't lie about being the devil. He's
Lie about being a devil. Uh-huh.
well, yeah, because like the guy, he always tells the truth, but at any time you could take the person aside and just show him his true self, and they would instantly believe him. But because he's just saying he's the devil, like, would you believe some random guy claiming to be the devil to be the devil? Like,
You would think they had a mental health issue. Yes.
yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Hmm,
So for
okay,
the-
that's complicated. Oh, interesting. Thanks for sharing. Yeah. I'm just thinking that maybe we could expand on the equality and equity. Actually, I didn't really know the difference until I went to research the difference. The equality achieved is through treating everyone the same, regardless of the needs, and equity is achieved through treating people differently depending on the needs.
That's
So-
a good point to bring up. So if you think about the responses to the current pandemic, particularly early on, I think you can probably come up with some examples of where people were treated differently in order to make things fairer. So can you think of an example of how people were treated differently at different points in order to make things fairer, particularly in relation to food?
I was thinking about the vaccination actually. Like the moment when we found the vaccine, probably the medical, policemen, public servants will get the vaccines first, followed by, well, the last could be the commoners, like normal people like us. That I can relate to depending on the needs, equity, social equity. Yeah. Social equality, then I guess it will be in terms of food, that everyone really needs the food. But you can also put that context into status as well.
Yeah, but
Yeah,
can you think of an actual example from, say, the way that access to supermarkets was made different for different people?
Oh.
Can you remember? Anybody remember? It's quite
In
a while
terms of
ago now.
accessibility.
It's less anxiety producing at the moment, except perhaps in Victoria, where I live.
Oh, you mean the panic buy?
Yes, when people were panic buying, certain conditions were made different for some people in order to make things fairer for them. So people who were on shift work, or elderly people, or people who were working in ambulances, or nurses who might have long day shifts, supermarkets allowed them, when things were in strict lockdown, supermarkets allowed those people access at a particular time so that they could get in and out and get the groceries that they needed, and other people were not allowed, because with the panic buying, a lot of things disappeared from the shelves, and ambulance drivers and elderly people couldn't get, simple things like toilet paper.
Yeah.
So that
I
was
don't know
one
why people
way.
rushing by to.
That was
Yeah,
one
so
way.
that's equity.
Yeah, that's treating
Depending
people
on the
differently to end up with a just outcome, a fair outcome. And I think I wrote in a comment today about health that, yeah, I did. I wrote in a comment today where someone had talked about hospital access, that sometimes, say with a waiting list in hospitals, people who are on a waiting list for something that, they may be in discomfort, they may need a treatment, but if somebody who comes in has something that might threaten their life, that person will go ahead of them and so the person will go further down the waiting list. That can be very frustrating for the people on the waiting list because they have to wait longer, but the outcome is more just because someone's life is saved. You wouldn't want to keep someone waiting for a heart bypass operation and put them after someone who needed a knee replacement, because you can get around on a bad knee, you can wear a brace, but you can't get around with a heart that's about to fail. So those are the kinds of things that are also affected by equity. Making things fairer.
So
I just
complex.
remind people that we're getting quite close to the end, and that Ola has to run another session in about 10 minutes time, and she needs a little bit of changeover, don't you, Ola?
Thank you.
So if other people have questions, now is the time to speak up, so that we can let Ola get on to her next session.
I always relate fairness with justice. Somehow it just popped it, and I always connect these two together. I guess maybe the next week is talking about respect. So is it justice part of research work as well?
Having just outcomes, yes, and the fair distribution of outcomes is part of justice. So justice is a principle that's spoken about more explicitly in human ethics, rather than the research integrity principles, but it does also come into accountability and promotion that we look at, and respect, that we look at in the next couple of weeks as well. And I can also say that I know someone's about to start mowing right behind me. So I can hear in the background someone is mowing the lawn next door, and very soon it's going to end up going right behind this wall, and I'm going to become inaudible. So it might be a good time to get in that last question, and then we'll finish up.
We'll also post this recording in Kate's announcement in the end of this week.
Yes, I will post a recording or post a link to this recording in my announcement, rather than having a wrap-up video announcement at the end of the week. So I think maybe we should probably call it quits so that Ola can move on to the next one. Thank you, Ola, for...
It's a very interesting discussion, Kate, I must say. I attended a few of them this week, and I really enjoy and learn even a lot. So well done.
Okay. All right. So I'll see everybody else in next week's, or in the discussion threads, and in next week especially. Okay. See you.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.